Have you ever wondered why the most powerful military in the world would deliberately keep its deadliest warriors off the battlefield? What kind of soldiers could be so terrifying that their own country feared unleashing them more than they feared losing a war? Before we dive into this classified chapter of American military history, I need your help. Comment below telling us where you're watching from, and then hit that subscribe button. This channel depends on you to keep bringing these hidden stories to light. The algorithms try to bury content like this, so your subscription actually matters. In the winter of 1942, a series of classified documents began circulating through the highest levels of the War Department in Washington. These files, stamped with red ink and locked in safes that required 3 separate keys to open, contained recommendations that would make even the most hardened generals pause. The subject line read simply, Native Reconnaissance Units, Operational Assessment and Risk Analysis. What followed in those pages would remain buried in classified archives for more than 6 decades. The documents detailed something the American public was never meant to know. During the early days of World War II, military strategists had identified and begun training specialized units composed entirely of Native American soldiers. These weren't the famous Navajo code talkers, whose linguistic skills would become legendary. These were something else entirely. Something darker. Something the military brass called, in their private communications, the Phantom Battalions. Colonel Richard Ashford, a career intelligence officer stationed at Fort Bragg, wrote in a memo dated February 19, 1943, "The effectiveness of these units exceeds all projections. However, their methods raise serious questions about adherence to the Geneva Conventions. More troubling still is their psychological effect on our own troops. Soldiers who witness these units in action often require psychiatric evaluation. I must recommend immediate suspension of deployment pending further review." The memo was never acted upon. Instead, it was classified at a level above top secret, filed away with dozens of similar reports from commanders across multiple theaters of war. The story begins not in the war rooms of Washington, but in the vast reservations of the American Southwest. In 1941, as the nation mobilized for war, recruitment officers noticed something unusual. Young Native American men were enlisting at rates far higher than any other demographic group. They came from the Apache reservations in Arizona and New Mexico, from Lakota territories in South Dakota, from Cherokee lands in Oklahoma. They arrived at training camps lean, silent, and possessing skills that mystified their drill sergeants. Private James Whitehorse, an Apache from the Mescalero Reservation, could move through dense forest without making a sound. During a training exercise at Fort Benning, Georgia, he vanished into woodland that offered barely enough cover for a rabbit, then reappeared 2 hours later behind enemy lines, having neutralized 7 objectives. His methods left the evaluators disturbed. One training officer wrote, "Whitehorse completed the exercise with full marks, but I'm recommending he be transferred to a different unit. The other recruits are afraid of him." But Whitehorse wasn't transferred. Instead, he was quietly moved to a new program being developed at an undisclosed location in the New Mexico desert. The facility wasn't on any official maps. Local ranchers who accidentally wandered too close reported being turned back by military police, who wouldn't identify their unit or explain what they were guarding. The program had been conceived by a small group of officers who had studied unconventional warfare tactics used by Native American warriors during the Indian Wars of the previous century. They had read the after-action reports from cavalry units who had fought against Apache raiders, Comanche war parties, and Lakota warriors. What they found both fascinated and disturbed them. The Native Americans hadn't just been skilled fighters, they had employed psychological warfare tactics that were, in the dry language of military reports, devastatingly effective against enemy morale. Lieutenant Colonel David Morrison, who would later become one of the architects of the Phantom Battalion program, wrote in his personal journal, "We've been studying the wrong wars. Every military academy teaches Clausewitz and Napoleon, but we should be teaching Geronimo and Crazy Horse. These men understood something about warfare that we've forgotten. They understood that breaking an enemy's will is more valuable than breaking his body." The training program that emerged from Morrison's research was unlike anything the U.S. military had attempted before. It took the traditional skills that many Native American recruits already possessed and refined them into weapons of psychological warfare. Stealth movement wasn't just about staying hidden. It was about being heard at exactly the right moment, making the enemy aware of a presence they couldn't see. Tracking wasn't just about following footprints. It was about understanding the enemy's psychology well enough to predict where they would go before they knew themselves. By the spring of 1943, 3 full companies of Native American soldiers had completed the program. They were designated as Special Reconnaissance Units and given innocuous code names: Shadow Company, Ghost Company, and Phantom Company. On paper, they were standard reconnaissance units tasked with intelligence gathering behind enemy lines. In reality, they were something the American military had never fielded before and would never field again. The first deployment came in June of 1943. Shadow Company was sent to the Pacific Theater, specifically to the dense jungles of Guadalcanal, where American forces were locked in brutal combat with Japanese defenders. The official mission was to gather intelligence on enemy positions and movements. What happened instead would become the subject of whispered conversations and classified debriefings for years to come. Captain Robert Chen, a Chinese-American officer who served as liaison between Shadow Company and regular Army units, filed a report 3 weeks after the deployment began. Shadow Company achieved all objectives within 72 hours of insertion. Enemy radio chatter intercepted by our signals intelligence indicates widespread panic among Japanese units in the operational area. Multiple Japanese commanders reported attacks by forces they described as ghosts or demons. Several enemy units abandoned fortified positions without engaging American forces. I must note that Shadow Company achieved these results with minimal direct combat. Only 6 confirmed enemy kills, yet an entire Japanese battalion withdrew from strategic positions. Chen's report included a detail that was immediately redacted but later recovered when the documents were partially declassified. He wrote, "I accompanied Shadow Company on one patrol. What I witnessed disturbs me greatly. The unit operates with almost no verbal communication. They move through jungle terrain that regular infantry finds nearly impassable with extraordinary speed and silence. More troubling is their psychological approach to the enemy. They don't engage to kill. They engage to terrify. I observed them leaving signs of their presence that seemed designed specifically to unnerve Japanese soldiers. At one abandoned enemy camp, they had arranged personal items taken from dead soldiers in patterns that I'm told have specific meaning in Apache spiritual traditions. The psychological effect on the enemy appears to be profound." The Pacific campaigns saw all 3 companies deployed at various times. Ghost Company operated in New Guinea and the Philippines. Phantom Company saw action in Burma and later in the island-hopping campaigns. The results were consistently spectacular and consistently unsettling. Major General Harold Blackwood, commander of the 6th Army, sent a coded message to Washington in August 1943. Native units achieving remarkable success, however, concerned about methods. Request guidance on acceptable parameters for psychological operations. Also requesting rotation of these units to rear areas. Regular troops exhibiting stress reactions to their presence. The request was denied. The units were too effective. In an era when American casualties were mounting and public support for the war remained fragile, any tool that could break enemy resistance without massive loss of American life was too valuable to discard over squeamishness. The European theater would prove even more controversial. In late 1943, elements of Ghost Company were deployed to Italy following the Allied invasion. Their mission was to operate behind German lines in the mountains of central Italy, disrupting supply lines and gathering intelligence. Lieutenant Thomas Brennan, an Irish-American officer from Boston who served with regular army units in Italy, recorded his experience in a letter to his wife that was intercepted by military censors and never delivered. "Mary, I've seen something in these mountains that I can't fully explain. There's a unit operating up here. Scouts, they call them. But they're nothing like any scouts I've ever known. They're Indians, Native Americans, I should say. I watched them work last week. We were pinned down by a German machine gun nest on a ridge. These boys moved up the slope like smoke, didn't make a sound. 20 minutes later, the German firing stopped. When we advanced, we found the gun position abandoned. The Germans had fled, left their weapons, left everything. There was something in that position, something the scouts had left behind. I can't describe it in a letter. Maybe I'll tell you when I get home, if I can find the words. All I can say is those German soldiers were professionals, veterans from the Eastern Front who'd faced the Russians. But whatever they saw in that nest, it scared them so badly they ran. Our commander says the scouts are our secret weapon. I think they're something else. Something we shouldn't have let out of the box." The letter was filed with dozens of others expressing similar sentiments. The pattern was clear. The Native American units were extraordinarily effective, but their effectiveness came at a psychological cost that extended beyond the enemy. By the summer of 1944, as Allied forces prepared for the invasion of France, the War Department faced a dilemma. The native units had proven their value repeatedly. Intelligence estimates suggested they had contributed to enemy withdrawals and surrenders that saved thousands of American lives. But the reports from the field were becoming impossible to ignore. Chaplain Michael O'Brien, a Catholic priest serving with the Third Army, submitted a report that was immediately classified. "I've been asked to provide counseling to soldiers who have served alongside or witnessed the operations of certain specialized Native American units. These soldiers, many of them combat veterans with months or years of frontline experience, are exhibiting symptoms consistent with severe psychological trauma. They report nightmares, intrusive thoughts, and overwhelming feelings of dread. Several have expressed the belief that they've witnessed something fundamentally wrong, something that violates not just the laws of war, but deeper moral principles. I'm not qualified to judge military tactics, but I am qualified to assess spiritual and psychological harm. These soldiers are being damaged by what they've seen." The turning point came in December 1944 during the Battle of the Bulge. As German forces launched their surprise offensive through the Ardennes, American units found themselves surrounded and desperately outnumbered. Phantom Company was deployed to a sector near the Belgian town of Malmedy, where American forces were holding out against overwhelming German attacks. What happened in the forests around Malmedy over the next 72 hours would seal the fate of the Phantom Battalion program. The German offensive in that sector collapsed. An entire SS Panzer Division, considered among the most fanatical and dangerous units in the German military, withdrew in disorder. Intercepted German radio communications spoke of night attacks by forces that seemed to materialize from nowhere and vanish just as quickly. German soldiers reported hearing sounds in the darkness that froze their blood. Entire platoons refused to enter certain areas of the forest. When American forces advanced through the area after the German withdrawal, they found something that wasn't included in any official history of the battle. A full company of SS troops, nearly 200 men, had surrendered to a Belgian resistance unit. These were soldiers who had fought on the Eastern Front, men who had faced Soviet Guards divisions and held their ground. But they told their Belgian captors they would rather face execution than spend another night in those forests. Major General George Patton himself requested a debriefing with Phantom Company after the Malmedy operation. The meeting took place at a commandeered chateau 30 miles behind the front lines. Only 7 people attended. No official minutes were recorded. But Patton's personal driver, Sergeant Michael Delgado from San Antonio, Texas, was stationed outside the room and later testified in a classified hearing about what he overheard. "I heard General Patton's voice get real loud at one point," Delgado stated. "He said something like, 'I don't care if it wins us the damn war. We don't fight like that. We're Americans.'" Then there was silence for a long time. When the meeting ended, General Patton came out looking older somehow. He didn't say a word, just got in the car. On the drive back, he stared out the window and said, almost to himself, "Some weapons are too terrible to use, even against the Nazis." I never forgot that. Within a week, orders came down from the highest levels of command. The Phantom Battalion program was to be suspended. All 3 companies were to be withdrawn from frontline operations and reassigned to training duties stateside. The official reason given was that these units were needed to train new reconnaissance battalions. The real reason was buried in classified memos that wouldn't see daylight for over 60 years. Secretary of War Henry Stimson wrote in a confidential letter to President Roosevelt in January 1945, "Mr. President, I must bring to your attention serious concerns regarding certain specialized units operating in both theaters. While their effectiveness cannot be questioned, their methods raise profound moral and legal questions. Several Allied commanders have expressed alarm. More concerning are reports from our own soldiers who have witnessed these units in action. We risk creating a crisis of morale and discipline if we continue these operations. I recommend immediate cessation of the program and the most restrictive classification of all related materials." Roosevelt's handwritten response, found decades later in the National Archives, was brief. "Handle it quietly. Some things must be done to win a war, but some things, once done, must be forgotten." The 3 companies were quietly transferred back to the United States in the spring of 1945. They were stationed at remote bases far from major population centers: Fort Huachuca in Arizona, Fort Lewis in Washington State, Fort Carson in Colorado. The men were sworn to secrecy about their wartime operations under the authority of the Espionage Act. Violation would mean immediate court-martial and decades in military prison. But soldiers talk, especially soldiers who have seen things they can't process alone. And so the stories began to spread, quietly, in hushed conversations in veterans' halls and late-night gatherings where men who had been to war tried to make sense of what they'd witnessed. Private First Class Daniel Whitaker, a medic who had served in Italy, spoke at a small VFW post in rural Pennsylvania in 1952 after several drinks. His words were recorded by another veteran who had brought a wire recorder to preserve old war stories. "They moved like they weren't quite real," Whitaker said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Like they existed in between spaces. I saw one of them. Couldn't have been more than 20 years old. This Lakota kid from South Dakota. We were dug in near Monte Cassino, and the Germans had us zeroed in. This kid, he stood up in full view, didn't even crouch, and walked toward the German lines. We thought he'd lost his mind. But the Germans, they stopped shooting. Just stopped. We could see them in their positions, standing up, staring. The kid walked right through no man's land. Took maybe 15 minutes. When he came back, he was carrying a German officer's sidearm and a map of their positions. He handed them to our lieutenant and walked away without saying a word. That night, the entire German unit pulled out. Just abandoned positions they'd held for weeks. I asked the kid later how he did it. He looked at me with these black eyes, empty eyes, and said, "I showed them what was waiting for them in the dark." I didn't sleep right for months after that. The recording was confiscated by FBI agents in 1954 during an investigation into potential breaches of national security. Whitaker was questioned for 3 days and warned that further discussion of classified military operations would result in federal prosecution. He never spoke publicly about the war again. He died in 1963. His death certificate listed the cause as cirrhosis of the liver, but his daughter told a local newspaper he had barely drunk after that visit from the FBI. "Something broke in him," she said. "He was afraid all the time." Afraid of what? He never would say. The Native American soldiers themselves faced a different kind of silence. Many returned to their reservations, but they didn't speak about what they had done, not even to their own families. Traditional healers and medicine men noticed something was wrong. These young men who had gone to war came back changed in ways that went beyond the normal trauma of combat. Thomas Longfeather, a Lakota medicine man from the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota, was interviewed in 1998 for an oral history project about Native American veterans. He was 91 years old at the time, and his words were recorded just months before his death. The young men who came back from that war, some of them, they had done things that violated the old ways. They had used the sacred knowledge, the warrior traditions, but they had twisted them. War requires killing. This we understand. But what they did was different. They had weaponized the spirit world itself. They had taken the ceremonies meant to protect and used them to terrorize. And that kind of violation, it leaves a mark. Not just on the men who did it, but on their families, their communities. We tried to help them, performed healing ceremonies, but some wounds go too deep. 3 of the men I knew who served in those units took their own lives within 10 years of coming home. Others died young from drinking, from accidents. It was like something was hunting them. The military's official position remained consistent over the decades. The Phantom Battalion program never existed. The Native American soldiers who served in World War II were honored for their contributions, particularly the Navajo code talkers whose story could be safely told. But the other units, the ones that operated in the shadows, remained classified. In 1978, a researcher named Dr. Patricia Morrison, no relation to the colonel who had helped design the program, was conducting dissertation research on Native American military service. She filed a Freedom of Information Act request for documents related to specialized reconnaissance units in World War II. What she received was a stack of papers so heavily redacted that entire pages were solid black. But she noticed something. The redactions weren't consistent across different documents. By carefully comparing multiple files, she was able to piece together fragments of information that suggested something much larger than the official history indicated. Dr. Morrison's dissertation was never published. 2 weeks before her defense, she was visited by 2 men in dark suits who identified themselves as being from the Department of Defense. They informed her that her research touched on materials that remained classified for reasons of national security. She was given a choice: abandon her research or face potential prosecution under federal law. She chose to abandon it. She switched her dissertation topic to contemporary Native American education policy and completed her doctorate 6 months later. She never spoke publicly about her original research, but Dr. Morrison kept her notes. hidden in a safety deposit box in a bank in Albuquerque, New Mexico. When she died in 2007, her daughter found the box. Inside were copies of partially redacted documents, photographs, and handwritten notes detailing what Morrison had discovered. The daughter, Sarah Morrison Chen, attempted to publish her mother's research. Every major publisher she approached declined. Several expressed interest initially, but then withdrew after consulting with their legal departments. One editor told her off the record, "There are stories too dangerous to tell." This is one of them. The documents that Dr. Morrison had collected painted a disturbing picture. The Phantom Battalion program hadn't ended in 1945. It had continued in modified form through the Korean War and into the early years of Vietnam. New units had been formed, trained at the same remote facilities in New Mexico. But by the mid-1960s, something had changed. The soldiers coming out of the program were different, more unstable. Several had what the military termed psychotic breaks while still in training. One burned down an entire barracks building and was found catatonic, muttering in a language that linguists couldn't identify, not even as any known Native American dialect. In 1967, the program was permanently shut down. The official reason given in the classified memo was that modern warfare had made such specialized units obsolete. The real reason, according to documents Morrison had obtained, was that the military had lost control of what they had created. The last training facility in New Mexico was abandoned. All records were ordered destroyed. The soldiers who had served in the program were offered early retirement with full pensions if they agreed to even more restrictive non-disclosure agreements. Most accepted. A few refused and found themselves facing mysterious legal troubles, tax audits, and difficulties finding employment. One former member of the program, a man Morrison identified only as Subject 17 to protect his identity, agreed to meet with her in 1976. They met in a diner in Gallup, New Mexico. Morrison's notes from that meeting are chilling. "He wouldn't tell me his real name," Morrison wrote. "He was maybe 50 years old, but looked 70. He chain-smoked through the entire conversation, and his hands shook constantly. He told me that what the military had done was take something sacred and make it profane. He said the old warriors, the ones from before the reservations, they had rules. They understood that certain powers could only be used in certain ways, with certain protections, certain ceremonies before and after. But the military stripped all that away. They wanted just the power, just the fear, without any of the safeguards. He said it was like taking plutonium out of a reactor without any shielding. Dangerous for everyone, including the person handling it. He told me that, of the 42 men who went through the program with him, only 11 were still alive. Most of the others had died violent deaths or killed themselves. He said something was wrong with all of them, something broken that couldn't be fixed. Then he said something I'll never forget. We opened doors that should have stayed closed, and some of those doors, they swing both ways. We thought we were sending nightmares at the enemy, but nightmares have a way of coming home. Subject 17 died 3 months after that meeting. His body was found in his trailer on the Navajo reservation. The official cause of death was listed as exposure, but the circumstances were strange. It was midsummer, temperatures over 90 degrees. Yet he had barricaded himself inside, covered every window with layers of blankets and cardboard, and died huddled in a corner. The tribal police officer who found him noted in his report that the man's eyes were wide open, fixed on the door, and his face was locked in an expression of absolute terror. The stories continued to surface sporadically over the decades. A retired Army colonel giving a lecture at West Point in 1982 made a passing reference to Indian Scout units that had operated with unusual autonomy during World War II. He was interrupted by a senior officer in attendance who requested he move on to a different topic. After the lecture, the colonel was pulled aside and strongly encouraged not to discuss that particular subject again. He followed that advice. In 1995, a documentary filmmaker named Marcus Chen began investigating rumors of classified military programs involving Native Americans. He conducted over 30 interviews with veterans, historians, and members of various tribal nations. He assembled over 100 hours of footage. The documentary was scheduled to air on a major cable network in 1997. 2 weeks before the air date, the network canceled it without explanation. Chen tried to shop it to other networks. None would touch it. He attempted to release it independently, but his hard drives containing the footage were stolen from his car in a smash-and-grab robbery in Los Angeles. The thieves took the drives but left his laptop, camera equipment, and several $1,000s in cash visible in the vehicle. No arrests were ever made. Today, the official story remains unchanged. The Native American soldiers who served in World War II, Korea, and Vietnam are honored as heroes, and rightly so. But the Phantom Battalion, if it existed at all, remains buried under layers of classification that show no signs of being lifted. Requests for declassification are routinely denied on grounds of national security, even though nearly all the participants are now deceased. But there are hints if you know where to look. Certain veterans' cemeteries on or near Native American reservations have clusters of graves from men who served in World War II and died unusually young in the years that followed. In the National Archives, researchers occasionally stumble across memos with tantalizing fragments visible between the redactions. And on certain reservations, elders still tell stories, quietly, about young men who went to war and came back carrying something dark that they could never put down. In 2019, the Army opened a new investigation into historical injustices against Native American service members. Activists hoped this might finally lead to declassification of documents related to the Phantom Battalion program. But when the investigation's initial findings were released, there was no mention of any such program. The lead investigator, when asked about this in a press conference, stated flatly, "We have found no evidence that any program by that name ever existed. There are rumors and speculation, but the official historical record does not support the existence of such units." Yet 3 months after that press conference, the same investigator resigned abruptly from his position. He moved to rural Montana and refused all requests for interviews. A colleague who spoke on condition of anonymity said, "He saw something in those archives, something that shook him badly. He wouldn't say what, just that there were things in our military history that needed to stay buried. He seemed afraid, not just of losing his job or his security clearance, but genuinely afraid." The question that haunts those who have investigated this story is not just what happened, but what it means. If the Phantom Battalion program existed, if the United States military truly did develop methods of psychological warfare based on Native American warrior traditions and then deemed those methods too terrible to use, what does that say about the nature of war itself? What does it say about the limits of what we're willing to do to win? And there's another darker question. If these programs really were shut down, really were buried and forgotten, why does the government continue to actively suppress information about them? Why threaten researchers and documentarians? Why maintain classification on documents from wars that ended half a century or more ago? What are they still protecting, or protecting us from? Some researchers believe the answer is simpler than conspiracy theories would suggest. The government, they argue, is protecting itself from the revelation of war crimes, from the exposure of methods that violated the Geneva Conventions and basic human rights. The Phantom Battalion, in this view, represents a shameful chapter that those in power would rather erase than acknowledge. But others, particularly those who have spoken with the few surviving members of these programs or their descendants, believe something else. They believe the secrecy continues because the programs never truly ended. They believe elements of what was learned, what was developed, continue to be used in the shadows of modern warfare. Special operations forces deploying to remote regions, classified programs with innocuous code names, psychological operations that achieve results that seem almost supernatural in their effectiveness. And then there are those who believe the secrecy continues for a different reason entirely. That Subject 17 was right when he said they had opened doors that swing both ways, that what was unleashed in the forests of Europe and the jungles of the Pacific didn't simply disappear when the programs were shut down, that the men who came home carrying that darkness spread it, passed it on, left it behind them like a contagion. There are places, they say, in the mountains of New Mexico, where the old training facilities once stood. The buildings were demolished decades ago, but the land remains federal property, fenced off and patrolled. Local ranchers report strange occurrences in those areas. Livestock that refuse to graze near the boundaries, sounds in the night that don't match any known animal, a feeling of being watched, of oppressive dread that descends without warning. And there are veterans, a very few, still alive, who carry what they saw with them. They don't speak of it, not anymore. The warnings they received were clear, and most have families they don't want to endanger. But sometimes, late at night, they remember. They remember men who moved through darkness like they were part of it. They remember eyes that reflected no light. They remember sounds that came from human throats but formed no human words. They remember fear, a fear so pure and primal it transcended rational thought. One such veteran, now in his late 90s, lives in a small town in Oregon. He served in the Pacific during World War II. He was there when Shadow Company operated in the jungles of New Guinea. He has never told his story publicly, and never will. But his grandson, who cares for him now, has watched the old man wake screaming from nightmares more than 70 years after the war ended. He's heard his grandfather, in the confusion of those midnight moments, speaking words in languages he never learned, seeing things that aren't there, begging forgiveness from people who have been dead for decades. "He's apologizing," the grandson said in a private conversation. "He keeps saying he's sorry, that he didn't know, that he didn't understand what he was seeing." He talks about shadows that moved wrong, about sounds that made men weep, about finding Japanese soldiers who had died from no visible cause, just lying there with their eyes wide open, looking at something that terrified them to death. And he keeps saying the same thing over and over. They're still out there. They never came all the way back. The truth about the Phantom Battalion may never be fully known. The men who conceived it are dead. The men who served in it are nearly all gone. The documents remain classified. The witnesses have been silenced by time, if not by threats. What remains are fragments, whispers, questions that have no official answers. But perhaps that's fitting. Perhaps some stories are meant to exist in the margins, in the spaces between the official history and the lived experience of those who were there. Perhaps some truths are too dark, too troubling, to be fully exposed to light. What is certain is this: war changes men. It always has, and always will. But some changes run deeper than trauma, deeper than memory, deeper than healing can reach. And when those who wage war take sacred knowledge, ancient traditions, and twist them into weapons, they create something that transcends ordinary violence. They create a wound in the world itself, a rupture that doesn't close, when the fighting ends. The Native American soldiers who served their country did so with honor and courage. This cannot be questioned. But some of them, a few, were asked to pay a price that went beyond blood and sacrifice. They were asked to weaponize their very souls, to become instruments of a fear so profound it violated something fundamental in the human spirit. And if the stories are true, if the whispers hold truth, then that price is still being paid, not just by those men, long dead or dying, but by the land itself, by the places where they trained and fought, by the darkness they called forth and could never fully send back. So when you hear stories about secret military programs, about warriors too dangerous to deploy, about methods of warfare so effective they had to be buried, remember this: power without wisdom is destruction. Victory without honor is defeat. And some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed again. In these times of uncertainty, when shadows seem longer and the world feels darker, perhaps the real lesson of the Phantom Battalion is this: that true strength comes not from embracing darkness, but from resisting it. That the greatest warriors are not those who inspire the most fear, but those who stand for something beyond fear itself. And perhaps, in the end, the only protection against the darkness we create is the light we choose to follow. The eternal truth that no matter how deep the shadows, there is always a way back to grace, to redemption, to peace. For those who believe, that light has a name: Jesus Christ, the one who walked through his own darkness and emerged victorious, who offers healing for wounds that go deeper than flesh, who promises that no door opened by man is beyond his power to close, no darkness so complete that his light cannot penetrate it. The Phantom Battalion may or may not have existed in the forms described here, but the human capacity for both darkness and light, for both violence and redemption, is undeniable. Which path we choose as individuals and as a nation determines not just who wins the wars we fight, but who we become in the fighting. The choice, as always, remains ours.